They cut him open while he was still awake. He could feel the hands moving inside his chest. He could not feel the people they belonged to. Understand what that means? This was one of the most powerful Force users alive. Since he was a child, he had been able to sense every living thing around him without looking. It was more reliable than his eyes, and the Force told him the room was empty. Something was taking him apart, and there was nobody there. They were not doing it to kill him. They were doing it to build something. They put a living creature inside his body, not armor worn over him. A creature, fitted to his bones, grown into his spine, sealed inside him while his heart was still going. Then they left him breathing, because for them, the work was not finished when the screaming stopped. He escaped. No record explains how. He never got it out. It was still inside him 100 years later. It was still growing, and by then he was sitting on the throne of the galaxy. Not a sector, not some warlord's empire out past the charts. The galaxy, every world, every fleet, every trade lane, under one hand, with the Jedi hunted down to almost nothing, and no rival power left standing anywhere in known space. He is the Sith who won, not the one who almost won, not the one who held it for 20 years before a farm boy shot down his station. He took it, he kept it, and there was nobody alive who could take it back. His name was Darth Krayt. He chose that name himself, and he chose it carefully. It comes from a monster that lives under the sand of his homeworld, a thing that swims through solid rock, a thing you hear moving beneath you about half a second before it reaches you, which is not enough time, and is not meant to be. It is the most honest thing he ever did, because here is what nobody tells you about him. He was not born a Sith. He was born a Jedi's son. He was raised by a people who loved him. He was trained in the light by one of the wisest beings of his generation. He fought for the Republic. He survived the massacre that wiped out almost every Jedi in existence. And there was one afternoon, on a worthless desert planet that nobody cared about, when an old man had him beaten and disarmed and helpless. One stroke. That was all it would have taken. The old man had him, and he chose mercy, and he walked away. Everything you are about to hear happens because of that single decision. 150 years of it. So how does a Jedi become the most successful Sith Lord in 10,000 years of Sith Lords? Not the way you think. Nobody seduced him. Nobody whispered to him out of a tomb. There was no moment of temptation, and no bargain offered in the dark. He worked it out himself, slowly, from evidence. And every single piece of that evidence was handed to him by the galaxy he was trying to serve. That is what makes this one different. That is what makes it worse. And then the galaxy went to work on him. What makes this particular Dark Lord different from every other one you have heard about is not that he wanted power. They all wanted power. It is not that he was cruel, because plenty of them were crueler. It is that he was correct. He looked at a galaxy that had collapsed 4 separate times inside a single lifetime, and he made a diagnosis. He said that freedom had been tried and had produced only slaughter. He said that the Jedi had been given 1,000 generations to hold the peace together and had failed at it in the most humiliating way possible, from the inside, by producing the very man who destroyed them. He said that the Sith themselves had been their own worst enemy, that every one of them since the beginning had spent more energy murdering each other than conquering anything. He said the problem was never that someone had held the galaxy too tightly. The problem was that nobody had ever been willing to hold it tightly enough. And then he went and did it. Not in a vision, not in a prophecy. He spent 100 years building an order in total silence, underneath a galaxy that had no idea anything was down there. And when he finally brought it into the open, it took him less than a decade to own all of it. That is the part people talk about. Here is the part they do not. The thing they sealed inside his body never stopped. Every year, there was a little more of it and a little less of him. By the time he took that throne, there were sections of him with no human tissue left in them at all. It had grown across his skull and around his jaw until there was no face. Only a shell with something looking out of it. He was in pain every waking hour for more than a century. Not discomfort. Not an old injury that aches. Continuous, structural agony. From a creature bonded so deeply into his nervous system that it could not be numbed, because numbing it would have meant numbing him. Every physician, torturer, and flesh shaper in his empire was put on the problem. Whole worlds of subjects were taken apart, looking for an answer. Nobody ever got it out. It was killing him, and it was making him stronger while it did. So here is the shape of the story you are about to hear. A man who spent his entire life being remade by other people's hands, until he decided that the only way to be safe was to remake everyone else. And it starts on a planet that nobody in the galaxy has ever cared about. The world was called Tatooine. If you knew nothing else about it, you would know it as a place people escape from, and never a place people arrive at on purpose. It sits far out on the edge of the settled galaxy, in a region where the law is a suggestion, and the nearest thing to a government is whichever crime lord happens to be fat and old enough to have survived his rivals. Slaves are bought and sold openly there. Ships come in with cargo that has no paperwork and leave with cargo that has less. Above ground, there are farms, scraped into the crust by people who pull water out of the air 1 cup at a time. There are settlements with names that sound bigger than the places themselves. There are canyons the color of old bone, and salt flats, and a wind that files the paint off a hull in a season. And spread across all of it, moving in a pattern that no outsider has ever successfully mapped, there are the Tusken Raiders. The settlers call them Sand People. The settlers describe them the way you describe weather or disease. They come out of the wastes at dusk, single file so their numbers cannot be counted. And they take what they came for, and they are gone before anyone can organize a response. The farmers speak about them the way you speak, about something that is not really a people at all, something that happens to you. The Tuskens have their own account of this, and it is very different. And almost nobody in the galaxy has ever bothered to hear it. They will tell you they were there first. They will tell you that everything the settlers own was taken from ground that already belonged to somebody, and that the wells the farmers are so proud of are being drilled into the last water of a dying world. They will tell you that a people who are being erased are entitled to fight, and they will tell you about the wrappings. This is the detail that matters most. So, hold on to it. A Tusken does not show flesh. Not to a stranger, not to a friend, not to the sons. From the time a child is old enough to walk, they are bound in cloth and leather and breathing filters. And that covering is not clothing. It is identity. It is the border between a person and a world that wants to dry them out and take them apart. To be seen unwrapped by another person is a catastrophe. In the strictest reading of their law, a Tusken who is uncovered in front of others has ceased to be a Tusken at all, and must leave, or die, or become something new. A person is what they are wrapped in. Remember that. It is going to come back at the end of this story wearing a very different face. Now, into that world, a long time before any of this, came a man who had no business being there. His name was Sharad Het, and he was a Jedi Master. And for a while he was one of the most famous beings in the galaxy. Understand what that means. Because the Jedi did not generally produce celebrities. They produced diplomats and negotiators and quiet people who solved problems that most citizens never learned had existed. Sharad Het was not that. Sharad Het was a warrior in an age that had almost forgotten what one looked like. And when the Republic found itself in the kind of trouble that talking could not fix, his was the name that came up. He was tall and pale, and he fought like something out of the old records. He won battles that were not winnable. He was decorated by governments that had no business decorating a Jedi. There were hollow recordings of him. There were children on core worlds who knew his face. For a brief period, if you had asked an ordinary citizen of the Republic to name a Jedi, there is a decent chance Sharad Het is the name they would have given you. And then he stopped. The accounts of why are incomplete, and the Order was never eager to discuss it. What is known is that somewhere in the middle of all that glory, he lost something he could not replace. Some tellings say it was a brother. Some say it was a battle that went so badly that no version of it could be called a victory. No matter how the reports were written, what is agreed is that Sharad Het came home from a war he had won and found that winning had not done what he expected it to do. He looked at the Order that had made him a weapon, and he did not see wisdom. He saw a committee. He saw very calm people in a very tall tower on a world where you cannot see the ground, deciding which fires to put out and which ones to let burn, and calling the decision serenity. So he left. He did not fall. That is important. There is no evidence that Sharad Het ever touched the dark side of the Force in his life. He simply took his lightsaber and walked away from the Jedi Order at the height of his fame. And he went as far from Coruscant as a person can physically go. He went to the sand. Nobody knows exactly how he survived his first year there. And the people who could tell you are not the kind of people who write things down. What is known is that a man arrived alone in the wastes of Tatooine with a green lightsaber and no water, and that he did not die. The Tuskens found him, of course. They find everyone, and by every reasonable expectation, that should have been the end of Sharad Het. Instead, he did something that nobody in the recorded history of that planet had ever done. He did not run from them, and he did not slaughter them, and he did not try to explain himself. He fought them, on their terms, in their way, until they stopped seeing an intruder and started seeing something else. He fought a duel he was not supposed to survive, and he survived it. He fought another. Somewhere in there, the calculation changed, and the Tuskens made a decision that must have astonished them at the time. They took him in. They wrapped him. They gave him the cloth and the filters and the goggles. And in doing so, they made him one of them. And by their law, that meant his face was gone. Sharad Het, the war hero, the recognizable one, the man with the famous face, put on the wrappings of a people who consider a face to be a private thing, and disappeared inside them. He did not stay a guest for long. Whatever he had been in the Republic, he was still that here. And a tribe that acquires a Jedi Master learns quickly what it has acquired. He fought their wars. He fought them well. He rose the way he had always risen. And within a few short years, the man who had walked out of the Jedi Order was a warlord of the Tusken Raiders, uniting clans that had been at each other's throats since before the Republic existed. And he married. Her name was Kashyyyk. Almost nothing about her survives, because almost nothing about any Tusken survives in a galaxy that never considered them worth recording. We know her name. We know she was a warrior of the tribe, and we know that she chose him, and that he chose her, and that whatever this was, it was not conquest, and it was not politics. It was a marriage. They had a son. The boy was called Asharad Het, and he was born into the wastes. And from the day he could walk, they wrapped him. Try to sit inside that childhood for a moment, because everything that comes later grows out of it. He was a Tusken, not partly, not symbolically. He was raised in a Tusken tribe, in Tusken law, speaking the Tusken tongue, eating what the tribe ate, and fighting when the tribe fought. He was taught to ride, and to track, and to move at dusk, and to bring down prey much larger than himself. He was taught that water is life, and that a person who wastes it has committed something close to murder. He was taught that the settlers were thieves. He was taught that the galaxy beyond the sky was full of people who did not know his people existed and would not have cared if they did. And he was taught the covering. The wrappings went on, and they did not come off. And he learned early that the worst thing that could happen to a person was to be seen. But he was also a Jedi's son. His father did not hide what he was. Asharad Het taught the boy the Force, not as an outsider's curiosity, but as a thing that was simply true about the world, the way heat is true and thirst is true. He taught him how to feel the movement of a living thing through the sand. He taught him how to slow his own heart. He taught him how to use a lightsaber. And by every account, Asharad Het could handle a blade before he could have held a written argument. So this boy grew up standing on a line that no one else in the galaxy was standing on. He was the child of a people that most of the galaxy regarded as vermin, and he was the child of a Jedi Master. He knew he was different from every other child in his tribe, and he knew that the wider galaxy, if it ever noticed him, would see only the wrappings and the goggles and the stories about creatures that come out of the desert to take what is not theirs. He belonged completely to two worlds, and neither of them would have him whole. There is a particular kind of person that this produces. Not a weak one, a very hard one. Usually, someone who learns young that being accepted is conditional, that it can be withdrawn, that the ground under your feet is not actually ground. Someone who decides, somewhere around the time other children are learning to trust, that the only reliable thing in the universe is control. He was still a boy when the galaxy came looking for his father. It came, as these things usually did on Tatooine, in the form of money. A crime lord had a problem. Asharad Het had made the Tuskens organized, and organized Tuskens were interfering with the flow of things. And the flow of things was where a Hutt's fortune came from. Raids that used to be an inconvenience had become a campaign. Somebody was going to have to remove the man responsible. But you do not send ordinary hired guns after a Jedi Master. That had been tried. The desert had absorbed the results. So a bounty was posted. And it was very large. And eventually, it reached exactly the wrong person. At the same time, and this is one of those coincidences that only looks like a coincidence, The Jedi Order finally learned where Sharad-Het had gone. Word came back to Coruscant that the missing master was alive on a worthless Outer Rim planet, that he had taken up with a people the Republic barely acknowledged, and that he was leading them in what was starting to look like a war. The Council did what the Council always did. They discussed it, and then they sent someone to bring him home, or at least to find out what had become of him. They sent Ki-Adi-Mundi. He was a Syrian, from a species with an enormous elongated skull housing a binary brain, which gave him a quality that everyone who met him remarked on. He was not merely intelligent. He was capable of holding two full lines of thought at once and following both of them to the end. He was calm in a way that went past discipline into something structural. He was, by the standards of that generation, one of the finest members of the entire order. He came to Tatooine expecting a diplomatic problem. He found the desert instead, and he found the tribe, and eventually, at the end of a great deal of difficulty, he found Sharad-Het. The two masters spoke. We do not have a full account of that conversation, and honestly it may be better that we do not, because the shape of it is easy enough to guess. One man asking another to come back, the other man explaining patiently that he had not left anything worth coming back to. Ki-Adi-Mundi would have argued from principle. Sharad-Het would have gestured at the wastes and at the people in them and asked which of the two of them was actually doing something. And beside them, listening, there was a boy in wrappings. Sharad-Het had never met another Jedi. He had been raised on the idea of them, this distant order his father had belonged to and abandoned. And now, here one of them was, standing in the sand, with that same steady voice and that same weapon at his belt, and looking at the boy the way you look at a problem that has not been solved yet. The Tusken child studied the Jedi Master, and the Jedi Master studied the Tusken child, and something began that neither of them had planned. It did not have time to develop, because the bounty hunter arrived. She was called Aurra Sing, and everything about her was assembled specifically to hurt people like the Hets. She was tall and bone-white, with a shaved skull and a single long tail of hair, and a sensor antenna implanted directly into her head that let her track a target's biological signature through walls. She was fast in a way that ordinary people do not process in real time. She carried a slug rifle for distance and lightsabers for close work, and the lightsabers were not hers. They had been taken. That was the point of them. She collected them, because Aurra Sing did not hunt for money. Not really, though she took the money. She hunted Jedi. There are accounts that she had been Force-sensitive herself as a child, that she had been in the temple, that something had gone wrong there and she had been taken away or had run, and that whatever was left afterward had spent the rest of its life circling back toward the Order with a weapon. The records are contradictory, and she was not the kind of person who granted interviews. What is not contradictory is the trophy rack. She came for Sharad-Het, and she got him, not in a duel. That is the part that has stuck to this story for a century. There was no confrontation, no exchange of philosophy, no moment where the great warrior faced his end with a blade in his hand. She simply took a position at distance, and she waited. And she used the rifle. The most celebrated fighter of his generation, the man who had walked away from the Jedi Order and built something new out of nothing in the worst place in the galaxy, went down in the sand with a hole in him, killed by a shot he never saw. His son was there. That is the fact that everything after this is built on. Sharad-Het watched his father die, and there was nothing about it that made sense, and there was nothing about it that was fair, and there was nothing he could do. He had been taught that strength decides things. He had been raised by a man who had never lost, and he watched that man be deleted from the world by someone who never even came within reach of him. He did not learn from that moment that the galaxy is cruel. Every child on Tatooine already knows that. He learned that being strong is not enough, that you can be the best there has ever been and still be removed at range by something that saw you before you saw it. You cannot understand Darth Krayt without understanding that lesson. Everything he built afterward, every layer of secrecy, every century of patience, every piece of armor, and every redundancy, and every apprentice bound by a philosophy designed to survive its founder's death, all of it is a child in the sand, deciding that this will never happen again. The tribe scattered. With Sharad dead, the alliance he had assembled came apart, because it had always been his and not theirs. And the old divisions reasserted themselves within days. The boy was suddenly alone in a way that a Tusken is almost never alone. And Ki-Adi-Mundi did the only decent thing available to him. He took the boy off-world. There was a case to be made against it, and the council made that case at length. The child was old for training, well past the age at which the Order normally accepted anyone. He had already been shaped by a culture built around vengeance and survival. He had watched his father murdered, and he was very clearly not at peace about it. And the Jedi had a long institutional memory about what happens when you train an angry child. But Ki-Adi-Mundi had made a promise in the desert, and he kept it. And the council, as it did more often than its reputation suggests, allowed itself to be persuaded. So Asharad came to Coruscant. Imagine the arrival. He had never seen a building taller than a rock formation. He had never seen standing water. He came from a world where the sky is empty and the ground is the enemy, to a world where there is no ground at all, only city, stacked and stacked and stacked until the bottom levels have not seen a sun in thousands of years. And he came wrapped. He would not remove the coverings, not for the medics, not for his instructors, not for the other children. He kept the cloth and the mask and the goggles, and he wore them in the halls of the Jedi Temple. And he made no apology for it. Understand what that looked like from the inside of that building. The Jedi Temple was the most cosmopolitan place in the galaxy. There were species there whose biology required breathing apparatus, species who communicated in scent, species who could not physically survive one another's atmospheres. Difference was not the problem. The problem was that everyone knew what those particular wrappings meant. They meant sand people. They meant the things that come at dusk. Half the initiates in that building had grown up on stories where creatures dressed exactly like that were the reason you did not go outside. It did not matter that the stories were mostly wrong, or that the boy inside the cloth was the son of a Jedi Master, or that he had lost more before adolescence than most of them would lose in their lives. He walked those corridors as a walking piece of somebody else's nightmare, and he knew it. And he did not take the wrappings off. That was not stubbornness. It was law. In the only law he had ever been given, removing them would have meant he was no longer a person. He had already lost his father, his tribe, his planet, and his language. The covering was the last thing he had, and he held on to it with everything he had. The Order, to its credit, trained him anyway. Ki-Adi-Mundi took him as a Padawan personally, which was not a small commitment. The Syrian was already a council member, already carrying more responsibility than anyone being should, and he added to it a traumatized teenager from a culture the Republic did not recognize as a culture. And the boy, was good. That has to be said plainly, because the temptation is to write him as a failure the order should have caught. He was not a failure. Ashara-d-het was, by any measure, an exceptional student. He had been raised with a lightsaber in his hand, and he took to the formal styles the way a native speaker takes to grammar. He learned to fight with two blades at once, which very few Jedi ever bothered with, and he was better with two than most of his peers were with one. He was disciplined. He was quick. He passed his trials. He became a Jedi Knight, but something had not been fixed, and everybody who worked with him could feel it, and nobody could name it precisely enough to act on it. He was not angry. Exactly. Anger is loud, and anger is easy to spot, and the Jedi were very good at spotting anger. What Ashara-d-het had was quieter and harder to argue with. He was certain. He had grown up in a place where hesitation kills you, where you do not deliberate about a threat. You remove it. Because if you deliberate, you die of thirst while you are talking. He looked at the Jedi method, the debate, the caution, the enormous care taken to avoid doing harm, and he did not see wisdom in it. He saw the same thing his father had seen from a different angle. He saw people who were very comfortable, who had never actually been at risk, congratulating themselves on their restraint while other people paid for it. He kept that opinion mostly to himself. He was not a rebel. He served. He obeyed. He took the assignments he was given, and he completed them. And then the galaxy handed him a war, and the war handed him permission. The Clone Wars did something to the Jedi Order that 1,000 years of peace had not prepared it for. And the damage was done in the first week. For a millennium, the Jedi had been peacekeepers. That word was not decoration. It described an actual function. They arrived somewhere before a conflict became a war, and they talked, and they investigated. And occasionally they fought a small number of people over a small distance, and then they went home and wrote a report. There were Jedi who lived entire lives without drawing a weapon in anger. There were masters who had never seen a battlefield. Then a droid army came over the horizon on a rock in the Outer Rim, and by the end of that single afternoon, the Order had lost close to half its number in the field, and the survivors were handed command of an army that had been grown in vats without anyone in the temple knowing it existed. Overnight, the Jedi became generals. Nobody had trained them for it. They were experts in the ethics of a single decision, and they were suddenly responsible for 100,000 decisions a day, made under fire, with lives attached to everyone. Most of them adapted badly. Some adapted by becoming brittle and refusing to accept what the job required. Some adapted by breaking quietly and staying at their posts anyway, which was worse. Ashara-d-het adapted immediately. He was extraordinarily good at it. That should not be surprising. He had been raised in a warrior society by a warlord, in an environment where resource scarcity is total and mercy is a luxury priced beyond reach. He understood supply. He understood terrain. He understood that a raid succeeds because of the 2 hours of silence before it, not the 90 seconds of noise. Where other Jedi were learning the vocabulary of war for the first time in their 40s, he had spoken it since childhood. He won, consistently, on worlds the Republic had written off. In campaigns nobody expected to survive, the Tusken Jedi delivered results, and the Council noticed the results and filed the reports, and sent him somewhere harder. And with every campaign, a little more of the desert came out of him, because his methods were not the methods the Order taught, and everybody knew it. He was hard on his troops. But that is not the part that mattered. Every general is hard on troops. What separated him was the way he treated everything that was not his troops. Asharad Het did not accept the idea of a neutral party in a war. He had grown up in a conflict where a settler who did not personally raid a Tuscan camp still drank water pulled out of Tuscan ground. In his understanding, there was no such thing as a bystander. There were people helping you and people helping the enemy. And the second group did not become innocent because they were unarmed. So when a village supplied a separatist garrison, he did not distinguish between the garrison and the village. When prisoners represented a logistical burden that would slow a column and endanger the column's mission, he solved the logistical burden. When a population sheltered an enemy that was going to kill his men, he made sheltering that enemy so expensive that the population stopped. It worked. That is the horrible part. It kept working. His casualty numbers were low and his objectives were met. And the reports that came back to Coruscant said, secured. And secured is a word that does not require anyone to ask a follow-up question. There were Jedi who raised concerns. There were Jedi who filed those concerns formally. And the concerns went into a system that was drowning. In the middle of a galactic war, being run by a council that was watching its own people die in numbers, it could not replace, and the concerns did not produce a consequence, which taught Asharad Het something else. And this lesson was as important as the one he learned in the sand. He learned that the Order's principles were negotiable. He had heard them preached his whole adolescence. He had been told that the Jedi did not do certain things, that there were lines that were not crossed, that this was the entire difference between them and the enemy. And then he crossed those lines repeatedly and openly and delivered victories, and nothing happened to him. He did not conclude from this that he was getting away with something. He concluded that the Jedi had always known those principles were unaffordable and had simply never been under enough pressure to admit it. He decided he was not a hypocrite, and they were. He was doing out loud what the institution wanted done quietly. That is a genuinely dangerous conclusion for a person to reach. And there was exactly one Jedi in the Order who confronted him about it directly and refused to let it go. His name was Anakin Skywalker. The two of them should have been allies. Look at how much they shared. Both raised on Tatooine, on a planet the Republic regarded as beneath notice. Both born outside the Order and brought into it late, past the age when a child is supposed to be shaped. Both prodigies with a blade, both impatient with committees, both carrying a dead parent and an unresolved fury about it. Both certain, in the marrow, that the council was too slow and too cautious and too pleased with itself. They looked at each other and saw a mirror, and neither of them liked the reflection. Their disagreements were not abstract. They happened in the field, in front of soldiers, over specific decisions with specific bodies attached. Skywalker would find out what Het had ordered and would refuse to let it stand. Het would point out, with a calm that made it worse, that the alternative was more dead clones, and ask which of them was actually taking responsibility for the outcome. And Het had the more consistent argument. That is what makes those scenes so unsettling to read now. In nearly every one of those confrontations, Asharad Het is the one who is intellectually coherent. He has thought his position all the way through. He knows exactly what he believes and exactly why, and he can defend it without raising his voice. Skywalker's objections are correct, but they are instinctive, half-formed, argued from a feeling he cannot articulate under pressure, and Het takes them apart every time. He wins the arguments. He is wrong, and he wins the arguments. And there is something the two of them shared that neither could have named at the time, which is that both of them had already worked out that they were going to stop being Jedi. Neither had admitted it yet. Both had the shape of it in place. One of them would get there by way of love and terror and a whispering old man in a red chair. And the whole galaxy would learn his name for it. The other would take a much longer road. And by the time he arrived, the galaxy would be a completely different place. And he would arrive as something that made the first man look like an apprentice. The war ground on. 3 years. The Jedi were spread across 1,000 fronts, fewer of them every month, exhausted past the point where exhaustion is noticeable, holding a line for a republic that had already been eaten from the inside and had not noticed. And then a single instruction went out over the military network, and every clone soldier in the galaxy turned around and shot the Jedi standing next to them. They were not persuaded to do it. Nobody mutinied. There was no moment of doubt, no soldier who hesitated and had to be talked into it. A sequence in the tissue of their brains, put there before they were decanted, simply activated. And the men who had followed those officers for 3 years and would have died for them the previous hour executed them without changing expression. Some of the Jedi died in the middle of a sentence. Some died with their backs turned, in the middle of a battle, shot by the troops they were protecting. It was the most efficient extermination of a religious order in galactic history. And it took about an hour. Asharad Het was in the field when it came for him. We do not have a clean record of what happened in that hour. What is known is that his men turned, and that he did not die, and that a very small number of Jedi across the galaxy managed the same thing that night. And almost all of them were the ones who had never fully trusted anybody in the first place. He had spent his whole life waiting for the ground to give way. He had been told since childhood that the people around him were not really his people. He had watched his father be killed by an attack he never saw coming. He had never once relaxed into the assumption that the beings beside him would still be beside him in 5 minutes. The Jedi who trusted their soldiers died. He was not one of them. He got out. And then he was alone in a galaxy that had just finished changing shape. He would have found the recall beacon eventually, the way the other survivors did. The temple signal, still broadcasting, calling every surviving Jedi home to Coruscant. And then, if he was lucky and reached it in time, the second signal underneath it, put there at enormous risk by 2 old men who had gotten into that building and out again, telling anyone who could hear it that the first message was bait. Do not come home. There is no home. Scatter and hide, and do not use the Force where anyone can feel it. Take a moment with that, because it is the hinge of the whole story. Every institution that had ever claimed him was now gone. The order that had trained him was ash. The republic he had bled for had voted itself out of existence to applause. His tribe had scattered a decade earlier. His master, the Syrian who had come out into the desert to keep a promise, was dead in a field somewhere with his own troops standing over him. Everything Asharad Het had ever been told to believe in had failed. In public, all at once, and the failure had proved his private opinion of all of it exactly right. He had spent years quietly concluding that the Jedi were too slow, too soft, too fond of their own restraint. and that their principles would not survive contact with a serious enemy. And then a serious enemy arrived, and the entire order was erased inside a single hour by a plan they never detected. He had been correct. And being correct had cost him everything. There was one place left in the galaxy that had never lied to him. He went back to the sand. Tatooine had not noticed the fall of the Republic. That is worth saying out loud, because it explains why he went there. On 1,000 worlds, people were watching a new order announce itself and trying to work out what it meant for them. On Tatooine, there was nothing to work out. The planet had never been governed by anyone who could reach it. The Hutts had run it before, and the Hutts ran it after. 2 suns came up. The wind kept filing the paint off the hulls. It was the only place in the galaxy where nothing had changed. And he walked back into it, carrying everything that had. The tribes were where he had left them, older and smaller, and still fighting each other. And a man came out of the wastes toward them wearing the right wrappings, speaking the language without an accent, moving the way they moved, and carrying a weapon that they had seen exactly once before in their history. They knew immediately who he was. There had only ever been one family like that. What he did next took less than 2 years, and it was the most impressive, purely political achievement of his life. And almost nobody in the galaxy ever heard about it. He united the Tusken Raiders, all of them. Not one region, not one alliance of convenient clans that would come apart at the first argument over water. He put the entire species under a single command structure for the first time in its recorded existence. And he did it in a culture where clan loyalty is the deepest thing a person has, and outside authority is an insult. He could do it because he was not an outsider. That was the whole engine of it. He had been born inside that law. He had been raised inside it, and he could argue for it in its own terms. When he told them that the settlements were killing the desert, they did not have to be persuaded, because they already believed it. He was not converting anyone. He was organizing what they already thought. And he brought them something no Tusken had ever had, which was a plan that extended past the season. His father had done something similar, and had done it well. The son did it better, and he did it with 3 years of large-scale industrial warfare in his head. He understood staging areas. He understood that you strike the water supply and the transport before you strike the people, because a settlement without water evacuates itself and costs you nothing. He understood how a militia responds and how long it takes and what it does when its response fails twice in a row. He was not raiding. Raiding was what his people had been reduced to. He was running a campaign of removal, and it was working. The farmers started leaving. Not in a panic at first. In ones and twos, the way people leave, a place that has become slightly more difficult than it is worth. Then in families, then in whole settlements loaded up and gone, abandoning claims that had taken a generation to establish. There were regions of that planet where the human presence simply ended, and the wells were left to fill with sand. He was winning. He was giving his mother's people their world back. And if you take the Tusken side of this, which almost nobody ever has, then Asharad Het in that period is not a villain at all. He is the one figure in 10,000 years who took the most despised species on that planet and made it capable of defending itself. But of course, that is not the only way to look at it, because the people leaving those settlements were not the people who had taken anything from anyone. They were poor. Almost all of them had come to Tatooine because it was the last place that would have them. They pulled water out of the air one cup at a time, and they were not getting rich doing it, and the ones who could not afford to leave stayed and died. And there is a harder thing underneath even that, which is that by this point he was no longer only fighting for the desert. He had come back to Tatooine emptied out. Everything that had ever organized his life had been destroyed inside a single hour, and he had gone looking for the one structure that was still standing. And he had found it and taken command of it. The war he was running was righteous in its way. It was also the only thing holding him together. And a war that is holding a man together does not get to end. He was building an empire, a small one on a worthless planet. Out of a people the galaxy did not count, but the shape was already there. One authority, one will, no dissent, because dissent had been the thing that made his people weak. Every clan under a single hand, and that hand was his. And any Tusken who preferred the old way was an obstacle to survival rather than an opinion to be accommodated. He had already invented the rule of one. He just had not written it down yet, and then an old man came out of the desert to stop him. Obi-Wan Kenobi had been living out there for a while by then, in a hut in the wastes, doing nothing. That was the assignment. He was watching a child grow up on a moisture farm, and he was not permitted to be seen doing it, and every instinct he had ever been trained with was being held in check by a promise he had made to a dying friend and a very old master's advice. He had spent a career going toward trouble. Now he sat in a stone room and waited. For years, while the galaxy suffered without him, he would have known the Het name. Every one of his generation did. 2 Jedi met in the sand, and the whole tragedy of the age was compressed into that meeting, because they had both survived the same catastrophe and reacted to it in exactly opposite ways. Kenobi had lost everything and had chosen to become nothing. He had taken the destruction of the Order as evidence that the answer was patience, that the correct response to a galaxy in the hands of a monster was to protect one child and wait a generation and trust that it would matter later. It is an act of almost incomprehensible discipline, and it cost him more than dying would have. Het had lost the same things and had chosen to become everything. He had taken the same destruction as evidence that patience was suicide, that restraint was the disease, and that the correct response to a hostile galaxy was to seize whatever you could hold and hold it absolutely. Neither of them was going to talk the other one out of it. There was an argument first. There is always an argument first with Kenobi. He was, whatever else he was, a man who genuinely believed that people could be reached, and he had spent his life proving it and had recently failed at it on a volcanic world in a way that had ended the galaxy. He tried again anyway, and then they fought. Asharad Het was in his prime. Twin blades, raised to a weapon before he could read, hardened by 3 years of continuous war and 2 more of desert command. Obi-Wan Kenobi was past his best, out of practice, living on almost nothing, and had not drawn that weapon in years. Kenobi won. He won the way he had always won, which was not by being stronger. He won by refusing to be drawn into the shape of fight his opponent wanted, by conceding ground endlessly and giving nothing, by being immovable rather than overwhelming, until the other man's certainty spent itself against him and left an opening. It is the least glamorous way to win a duel, and Kenobi was the best there has ever been at it. He had Asharad Het beaten and at his mercy. And he did not kill him. That decision has been argued about ever since, usually by people who know how the story ends. It is easy to look at what this man eventually became and say that one stroke in the sand would have spared the galaxy a century of horror. That is true as far as it goes. It is also completely beside the point, because Obi-Wan Kenobi had killed exactly the wrong man once already, and had been living in a hut in the desert ever since, and he was never going to do it again, so instead he passed sentence. He struck the wrappings away. In Tusken law, that is not a humiliation. It is an execution. A person who is uncovered in front of others has stopped being a Tusken. There is no appeal and no ceremony to restore it, and no version of the law where it can be undone. The tribes did not need to be told what they had seen. The war leader who had united a species, the son of the Great One, was standing in front of his own warriors with his face in the open air, which meant that whatever was standing there was not him. He had held that covering through everything, through the loss of his father, through the temple corridors where children flinched away from him, through 3 years of war on worlds that had never heard of his mother's people. It was the last thing on him that his own culture recognized. Kenobi took it, and then he told him to leave and never return. And Asharad Het went. He went, and there was no longer a name for what he was. He was not a Jedi. That order had been dead for years, and he had been arguing with it long before it died. He was not a Tusken. The law he had been raised in had formally and publicly finished with him. He was not a citizen of anything, because the republic he had served had voted itself into an empire that would have shot him on sight. He had no tribe, no order, no world, no face, and no title. He had a lightsaber and a body and a very great deal of unfinished anger, and nothing at all to point it at. And so he wandered. This is the part of his life that no record accounts for properly. And it lasted a very long time. Decades. Long enough that a person who had known him would have assumed he was dead, and would have been reasonable to assume it. He went out past the edge of the charted lanes, into regions where the Empire's authority was a rumor, and the star charts stopped being maps and start being guesses. He took work. He took the kind of work that a man with a lightsaber and no scruples can get out there. And he was very good at it. And he did not stay anywhere. And while he did that, the galaxy went through everything you already know about. The Empire hardened into the worst government the species had ever produced. A station the size of a small moon destroyed a populated world as a demonstration. And then a second one. A rebellion assembled itself out of almost nothing and lost for years. And then, on a forest moon, at the edge of nowhere, one. An old man in a black mask picked up an emperor and threw him down a shaft, and the entire structure came apart. A new republic stood itself up in the wreckage. A new Jedi Order began, a handful of students in a temple on a swamp world, learning from a farmer who had been taught by a ghost. Asharad Het was in none of it, not one line, not one appearance. The most consequential 30 years in galactic history went past, and the man who would eventually rule all of it was somewhere out beyond the maps, taking contracts, telling nobody his name. He was watching, though. That is the thing to hold on to. He was watching the new republic assemble itself out of committee meetings and compromise, watching it seat delegations from worlds that had supplied the Empire, watching it argue about procedure while warlords carved up whole sectors. He was watching a new Jedi Order be built out of a dozen half-trained students and a great deal of hope by a young man who had learned the entire tradition from a ghost and a book, and he was drawing conclusions. Then something arrived that nobody in the galaxy had a category for. They came from outside, not from the unexplored regions, not from some overlooked pocket of the rim, from beyond the galaxy entirely, across the void between spiral arms, in a migration that had been underway for longer than the Republic had existed. They were called the Yuuzhan Vong, and everything about them was wrong in a way that took years to properly measure. They used no machines, not as a preference, as a religious prohibition. Every tool they had was alive. Their ships were grown. Their weapons were animals, bred over millennia into shapes that could be held in a hand. Their armor was a creature. Their communications equipment was a small living thing that clamped onto the side of the head. They did not build, they shaped, and they worshipped pain. Not endured it, worshipped it. Rank was displayed through mutilation, and status was accumulated by having more of yourself removed and replaced. And their priests offered the suffering of captured populations to gods that required it. But none of that is why they terrified the Jedi. They terrified the Jedi because they were not there. A Force-sensitive being goes through life with a sense that nobody else has. Every living thing in a room registers. A person walking up behind you registers. You do not have to look, and you never had to learn it, and it has been there since before you could speak. It is not an ability so much as a flaw. The Yuuzhan Vong did not register at all. They stood in front of a Jedi Master, and the Force reported empty space. A warrior could walk into a room where a Jedi was meditating and be perceived only when the door made a noise. Something in what they were, or something in what had been done to them long ago, had put them outside the thing that connects every living being in the galaxy. Imagine losing that flaw. Now, imagine the war. It was the worst thing that ever happened to the galaxy, by a distance that is difficult to convey. Entire populations were slaughtered as offerings. Worlds were not conquered but reshaped, terraformed into copies of a homeworld that no longer existed. The death toll was measured in the tens of billions, and then people stopped measuring. Coruscant itself, the center of civilization for 25,000 years, was taken and turned into something organic and warm and covered in vines. And somewhere in the middle of that, on some world that has no particular significance, they caught a man in the wastes with a lightsaber. There was no confrontation of note. He was not brought down by a champion. He was taken the way hundreds of thousands of others were taken, and processed the way they were. And then he was given to the Shapers. Their captives went into two categories. Most were sacrifices, and their deaths were the point. The rest were material. The Shapers were not sadists in the ordinary sense. A sadist wants a reaction. They were artisans. They had spent their lives learning what a living body can be made into, and a captive was simply a supply of tissue with a problem attached. And the problem was interesting. What they did to him has a name in their language and no clean translation. They took a Vonduan crab. This was the source of their armor. A creature bred over uncountable generations into a living shell that could absorb the energy of a blaster bolt and turn a lightsaber. Normally, it is worn. A warrior earns one, and it bonds to him, and it can be removed. They did not have him wear it. They put it into him. They opened him, and they fitted the living armor to the bone, and they let it take root. And they attached it to his nervous system, so that it was not something he carried, but something that carried him, and then they closed him up around it. and let it settle. He was awake. The Shapers preferred their subjects awake. Feedback improves the work, and this is the moment where the story stops being about a man's choices. So sit inside it for a second. He could not sense them. His entire life, since childhood, since before the temple, since his father teaching him to feel a creature moving under the sand, he had always known where the living things around him were. It was the most reliable sense he had. It was more reliable than sight. And now there were hands inside his body, and the Force said the room was empty. Whatever else was taken from him on that table, that is the thing that never came back. He had already learned that strength does not protect you. He had already learned that institutions fail, and that people you trust turn around and fire. Now he learned the last one, which is that there is no flaw at all, that the sense he had built his entire understanding of reality on could simply be absent while something took him apart. He escaped. Of course he escaped, or there would be no story. The details are not recorded, and it does not matter how. A man like that, in a facility staffed by artisans rather than soldiers, eventually gets an opening and takes it. But he did not leave the armor behind. He could not. That was the entire point of what had been done. It was not equipment anymore. It was in the bone of his skull and wrapped around his spine and threaded into muscle. And it was alive, and it was still growing. Understand what he was now, and understand it in terms of everything you have already heard. A Tusken is a person defined by what covers them. He had been raised in that. He had held on to that covering through the death of his father, through the temple, through the war. And an old man in the desert had finally stripped it off him and ended him with it. And the galaxy had given him a new one, permanent, unremovable, made out of the flesh of the one enemy that the Force itself could not perceive. He would never take it off. He would never be uncovered again. He had, in the most literal and horrifying sense available, gotten exactly what he had spent his whole life needing, and it was killing him. Slowly, over decades. Living armor requires a living host, and this one had not been designed for a human being. It would go on tightening and spreading and consuming him for the rest of his life. And there was no procedure anywhere in the galaxy that could get it out. He was dying from the day he escaped. He would go on dying for 100 years. A man in that condition goes looking for two things. He goes looking for a cure, and he goes looking for a reason. And the galaxy he came back into could give him neither. The war had ended. The Jedi had survived it. And they had survived it by adapting, by changing their understanding of the Force, by accepting help from an enemy they had spent years being unable to touch. It was a real achievement, and it had cost more than any victory in history. And Asharad Het looked at the galaxy that came out the other side and saw a patient in remission because nothing had been fixed. A government of arguments had been rebuilt on the same foundation as the last two, and the same crack was still running through it. And he had now watched that crack open 4 separate times inside one lifetime. The Republic, the Empire, the New Republic. And now this. 4 collapses. Tens of billions dead. And every time, the response was to rebuild the identical structure and hope. He was dying. He had no order, no world, no face, no people. And he had a diagnosis that he was now completely certain about. and no instrument anywhere in existence that could act on it. So he went to the one place where the answers had been written down by people who agreed with him. There is a planet in the far reaches where the sky is red and the wind sounds like breathing. It has a valley in it, and the valley is lined with tombs. And the beings in those tombs were the most powerful practitioners of the dark side that the galaxy has ever produced. They have been dead for thousands of years. It does not seem to have made much difference. Every Sith in history has ended up there eventually. Some are drawn, some are called. Some, like this one, arrive convinced that it was their own idea. Korriban had been picked over for millennia. It had been sacked, excavated, garrisoned, and abandoned. There was nothing left to find, and everyone knew it. He found something anyway. We do not have a full account, and we never will, because there was one person present, and he was not in the habit of explaining himself. What is known is that Asharad Het went down into a tomb in that valley, and that he was there a long time, and that whatever spoke to him in the dark did not have to work very hard. That is the genuinely disturbing part. There was no seduction. There is no version of this where a spirit whispers a temptation and a good man wavers. Everything the dark side had to offer, he had already worked out on his own, in the sand and in the field and on a shaping table. That freedom produces slaughter. That mercy is a luxury paid for by other people. That the only reliable thing is control, held absolutely by one hand that never lets go. He did not go into that tomb to be converted. He went in to find out whether anyone else had ever reached the same conclusion. And he found 10,000 years of them. And every one of them had failed for the same reason, and he could see the reason from the doorway. They had all fought each other. Every single one. The masters and the apprentices and the academies and the brotherhoods, all of them so busy with betrayal that they had never once managed to simply hold what they had taken. He understood, standing in that valley, that he was not going to make that mistake, that he had already spent a life learning why it happens and how to prevent it, that the answer was not 2 Sith or 1,000 Sith, but something nobody had ever tried. And the man who came back up out of that tomb had done what everyone else in his life had already done to him. He had taken the last thing he had and removed it. Asharad Het did not die on Korriban. He was discarded, the son of Sharad and Kashyyyk, the boy in the wrappings, the Padawan, the general, the warlord, the wanderer, the specimen. All of it put down in the dark and left there. What walked out took a name from the only world that had ever been his, from the thing that lives in the rock beneath the sand, the thing you hear before you see, the thing you are already too late to run from. He called himself Darth Krayt, and then he did the strangest thing any Sith Lord has ever done with a moment like that. He disappeared. Completely. No announcement, no atrocity, no message to the galaxy. He went into total silence, and he stayed there. And he was still there 100 years later, because he had just worked out what every Dark Lord in that valley had been too impatient to understand. That the Sith had never been defeated by the Jedi. That they had always, without exception, been destroyed by themselves. And that the only way to build something that could hold a galaxy was to build something that could survive its own founder. He was going to need an order that could not betray him. And he was going to spend the next 100 years building one, in complete darkness, while the galaxy above him went about its business and never once suspected that anything was down there at all. Every Sith who ever lived believed they had solved the problem. That is the thing you notice if you read enough of them. They all thought they were the correction. The Ancient Ones built vast empires with hundreds of Dark Lords in them and were destroyed by their own infighting. The ones who came after decided that the empire had been too large and built brotherhoods and academies instead, and those tore themselves apart faster. A man came along 1,000 years before the fall of the Republic and looked at the wreckage of all of it and made the most famous reform in Sith history. He decided there would be two, only ever two. A master to hold the power and an apprentice to want it. And when the apprentice was strong enough to take it, the taking would prove the succession was correct. That system lasted 1,000 years and produced the most successful Sith who ever lived. And it worked exactly as designed. And it ended on a walkway above a reactor shaft, with an old man being carried in the arms of the apprentice he had made. Darth Krayt looked at that entire history and reached a conclusion that nobody in 10,000 years had reached, which was that they had all been solving the wrong problem. They had been trying to manage betrayal. Two Sith. So, the betrayal is contained. A hierarchy of Dark Lords. So, the betrayal is at least productive. Rituals and tests and formalized assassination, all of it an elaborate machinery for making treachery survivable. He decided that the answer was to remove the reason for it. The Sith betray each other, he reasoned, because each of them is trying to become the Sith. Every apprentice is a candidate. Every subordinate is a rival with a timeline. The entire arrangement is a competition in which the prize is the whole thing. And any competition like that will eventually be entered by everyone who is capable of entering it. So he built an order in which there was nothing to compete for. He called it the Rule of One. And the phrasing is deceptively simple. There is one Sith, not one Sith Lord, one Sith. Everyone in that order, from the highest to the lowest, was not a Sith in their own right, but a part of a single thing, and that thing had one goal and one will and one purpose, and the purpose was the order itself. Read that carefully, because it is not what it first appears to be. It sounds like a man declaring himself supreme. It is not. Darth Krayt made himself the head of that body, but the whole architecture of the thing was built on the assumption that he would eventually stop being there. He was dying, and he knew it. Every structure he put in place was designed to keep functioning after the death of its founder, and that had never been true of any Sith organization in history. Every previous one had been an extension of one personality and had died with it. He built something that could bury him and continue. It is the single most intelligent thing any Sith has ever done, and it is the reason this story does not end when he does. But an idea is only an idea. He had to fill it, and the filling took him 100 years. Consider the scale of what that means. He went into the dark not long after a war that had nearly ended the galaxy, and he did not come out until everyone alive at that time was dead of old age, and their children were dead, and their grandchildren were running things. 4 generations passed above him. Governments changed shape twice. The Jedi rebuilt themselves into something larger and more confident than they had been in centuries. And underneath all of it, in tombs on a red world at the end of the charts, a man who was already dying was assembling an army out of nothing and never once tipping his hand. He recruited very carefully, and he recruited the way a doctor screens for a disease. He was not looking for power. He could train power. What he was looking for was the specific defect that had destroyed every Sith order before his. The individual ambition that says, I should be the one. He tested for it constantly, and anyone who showed it was not disciplined or demoted. They were removed. There are accounts of promising acolytes who advanced quickly, who had every gift, and who let something slip in front of the wrong person and were simply not present the following day. What he built out of that filtering was genuinely unprecedented, and it needs to be understood clearly, because it is why he won. He created the first Sith Order in history that was loyal, not obedient. Obedience is easy and cheap, and it evaporates the moment the master is weak. These were true believers. They had been selected for a temperament that finds relief in submission to a larger purpose, and then trained inside a philosophy that told them their own ambitions were the enemy, and the result was a body of dark side users who did not want the throne, who found the idea of wanting it embarrassing, who would have reported a colleague for it without hesitation, and did. He also built it wide. This is the part that the galaxy above never had any idea about, and it is the reason the reveal, when it finally came, was so total. Darth Krayt did not simply train Sith on Korriban and keep them there. He placed them, over decades, quietly. His order sent people out into the galaxy and put them into positions and left them there for entire careers, doing nothing, waiting for an instruction that might not come in their lifetime. They were in the imperial bureaucracy. They were in the intelligence services of two separate governments. They were in shipping consortiums and mining concerns and planetary administrations. They were inside the Jedi Order itself and had been for generations, and were regarded as respected members of it. A century of that, patient, undramatic, boring work carried out by people who accepted that they would probably die of old age at their desks without ever being activated, and who did it anyway because they had been taught that they were not individuals but parts of one thing that would still be there when they were not. And around him, at the center, he assembled the ones whose names the galaxy would eventually learn. There was a Chagrian called Darth Wyerlock, and the name is not one person. It was a lineage. The first held it, and when he died, his successor took the title, and then another, and the arrangement itself tells you everything about how Krayt's order worked. The individual was interchangeable. The function was not. The Wyerlocks were his voice, his administrator, his high priest, the one who spoke for him when he could not speak. Where Krayt was the will, Wyerlock was the doctrine. And it was a Wyerlock who wrote most of what that order actually believed. There was a Nagai called Darth Neil, a pale, scarred, brutal warrior who was as close as that order came to producing a pure soldier. He was not political. He was not clever in the way the others were clever. He was simply the most dangerous thing in a room, consistently, for 100 years. And he served without ever once appearing to consider an alternative. There was a Twi'lek called Darth Talon, red-skinned and tattooed with Sith markings over her entire body, taken as a child and raised inside the Order rather than recruited into it. She had never known anything else. She had no memory of a galaxy in which Krayt was not the center of everything, and she was, by some distance, the most completely converted being he ever made. There was a Deveronian called Darth Maladi, and she is the one you should be most afraid of. She ran intelligence and she ran research, and those two portfolios in her hands meant poisons, plagues, engineered pathogens, and the systematic manufacture of events. She did not fight. She did not need to. She was responsible for more deaths than every lightsaber in that order combined. And she was the one who eventually designed the atrocity that started the war. And there were the hands. Krayt's hands, chosen from among the strongest, who acted with his authority anywhere in the galaxy, and answered to no one else. That was the machine. One will at the center, doctrine underneath it. Soldiers and poisoners and infiltrators radiating outward, and 100 years of preparation with no rehearsal and no test run and no early move that might have given it away. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it was rotting. The armor had never stopped. It did what it had been grown to do, which was to spread through a host and integrate, and it had been doing that continuously since a shaping table on a world he never named. It was in his skeleton. It had grown across his skull and around his jaw, and down the length of his spine. And there were points where it was no longer possible to say where the crab ended. And he began. It kept him alive, in the sense that it was extremely hard to kill him. It was also consuming him. And no one in the galaxy knew how to reverse it, because the beings who had made it were gone and had not left instructions. So he spent that century in and out of stasis. That is how he survived long enough to see his plan mature. He would work and train and direct, and then he would go into a chamber and be suspended, and time would pass without passing for him. Years at a stretch. Long enough that acolytes were recruited, trained, aged, and died. Between his conversations with them, picture what that does to a mind. Sleeping in a tomb on a dead world for decades at a time. Waking to find that the galaxy has changed shape again, and the plan is one increment further along. Going back under, not living so much as being conserved. 100 years of that, with the armor tightening a fraction more every time. By the end of it, there is a real question as to how much of him was left. Not in the sense of possession or corruption. In the plainer sense that a person is a continuous experience, and his had been chopped into pieces and stored. And the thing that came out of that chamber at the end of it had been thinking about a single idea, without interruption or company or anything to distract it, for longer than most civilizations last. And while he slept, the galaxy above him built exactly the world he had been waiting for. Here is what a century of peace had produced. The Yuuzhan War had ended in something stranger than a victory. The invaders had not been driven back across the void. There was nowhere to drive them to. They had been broken, and then absorbed, and eventually settled on a living world of their own, and the galaxy had gone about the work of putting itself back together with tens of billions dead and hundreds of planets rendered uninhabitable. Out of that came a government called the Galactic Alliance, and it was the best attempt anyone had made yet. It was broader than the Republic and less naive than the New Republic, and it had a functioning military and a Jedi Order that had been through the worst thing in history and had come out with real institutional wisdom. And beside it, not underneath it, there was an empire that deserves a moment, because it is not what the word makes you think of. The empire of this era was not the one with the black armor and the planet killers. It had been reformed decades earlier into something that had renounced most of what its predecessor had done and had spent generations rebuilding a reputation. It was authoritarian, certainly. It was also competent, and it kept its treaties, and the worlds inside it were on the whole well governed. It was run by a hereditary line, and the man on the throne when this story reaches him was called Roan Fel. Fel was not a monster, and it is important not to flatten him into one. He was a hard, formal, deeply serious man who took the responsibilities of his office seriously and who genuinely believed that his empire was the more stable and more honest of the two great powers. He had a Jedi in his court, in an official capacity, which tells you how far that state had traveled from what it used to be. He was not looking for a war. Two large powers, a functioning peace, a Jedi Order that was larger and healthier than it had been in centuries. And underneath all of it, on a red world at the edge of the charts, an order of Sith that had been in place for 100 years, positioned inside every one of those institutions, waiting. They needed a war. That was the whole of it. Krayt's people were enormously capable, but they were not numerous enough to conquer a galaxy at peace. And the two great powers were far too strong to attack directly. But two great powers that destroy each other leave a throne standing empty. So Darth Malady went to work. The instrument she used was, with a symmetry that is almost too neat, the Ossus Project. Understand what that project was, because it is the most hopeful thing in this entire story, and that is exactly why it was chosen. Hundreds of worlds had been sterilized during the invasion, shaped, poisoned, terraformed into copies of a dead homeworld, and left useless. Whole populations had nowhere to go back to, generations later, and the Jedi had found a way to fix it. Working with Yuuzhan Vong Shapers who had joined the galaxy after the war, they had developed a method of using that same biotechnology in reverse. The living material that had ruined those worlds could be used to restore them. Seeds and organisms designed to undo the damage, applied world by world, over years, bringing dead planets back into life. It worked. That is the thing to hold on to. It genuinely worked. Worlds that had been written off were coming back green. And the Jedi were doing it publicly, in cooperation with the descendants of the people who had destroyed them. And it was the single greatest argument for their order that anyone had made in 1,000 years. Malady corrupted it. The details are exactly as ugly as you would expect from her. The organisms were altered, not everywhere and not all at once, because a uniform failure would have looked like a design flaw. It was done selectively, in a pattern, so that the results would look like something else entirely. The restored worlds began to change. The life the project had seeded did not stabilize into forests and grassland. It kept going. It spread past its parameters, and it became aggressive, and then it became lethal. And on the affected planets, the transformation did not stop at the vegetation. It reached the people, populations that had come home to a world that was finally alive again began to be altered by it, physically, into things that could not be reversed and mostly could not survive. The Jedi had done this. That was what the galaxy saw. Not a sabotage, because nobody knew there was anyone left alive who would want to sabotage it. What the galaxy saw was the Jedi Order taking enemy technology it did not fully understand and using it on populated worlds. And those worlds dying horribly, and the Jedi standing in the middle of it with no explanation that anyone could verify. The reaction was immediate, and it was enormous. And it was, from the outside, completely reasonable. The Empire demanded that the project be stopped and that those responsible be handed over. The Alliance refused because it knew its Jedi and could not accept the accusation. The Empire pointed at the dead. The Alliance pointed at the treaty. Each side hardened, and every hardening confirmed the other side's suspicion. And the whole apparatus of a galaxy that had been at peace for a century turned over and became an apparatus for war in under a year. It is worth stopping to admire the design of it, in the way you might admire a weapon. Krayt's order did not have to defeat anyone. They had to introduce one piece of information into a system and let the system do the rest. Every institution behaved correctly. The Empire was right to be furious. The Alliance was right to defend its people. The Jedi were right that they had not done it. Every single actor in that crisis made a defensible decision, and the decisions added up to a war that killed a staggering number of people. That is the thing about Krayt that separates him from every other Dark Lord you have heard about. He did not need to corrupt anybody. He understood that a large enough system will destroy itself if you tell it a lie at the right point, and that this is not a flaw you can train out of a government, and that it is therefore an argument against having one. The Sith Imperial War began, and it went the way he had planned. The two most powerful militaries in existence spent years grinding each other down. The Alliance was larger. The Empire was better organized and had the moral high ground in the public account of things, which mattered enormously, because worlds that had been part of the Alliance for generations began to consider whether they might be safer on the other side. And into that war, at exactly the right moment, came reinforcements that nobody had asked for, and nobody could explain. They arrived at the Empire's side, not as mercenaries, as allies, offering their service in the cause of ending a war that the Jedi had started. They wore red and black. They fought with lightsabers. They were led by a figure in living armor who called himself the Dark Lord of the Sith, and he came to Ronfel's court and offered his order's strength to the throne. Try to imagine being in that room. The Sith had been extinct for 130 years, not weakened, gone. The last of them had died on a battle station over a forest moon, and everyone knew the story, and it was as settled a historical fact as anything in the galaxy. Every scholar and every Jedi and every school child knew there were no more Sith, and 100 of them walked into the Imperial court. Ronfel did what almost any leader in that position would have done, and it damned him. He was in a war he was not certain he could win against a larger power, and an army of legendary warriors offered themselves to his cause at the precise moment he needed them. He accepted. He put conditions on it. He was not a fool, and he did not trust them, but he accepted. And the moment he did, the outcome of everything was fixed, because Krayt had spent 100 years preparing an order specifically designed for the moment when it would be invited inside. The war turned quickly after that. The Sith were not simply powerful individually, though they were. They had been trained for a century in a doctrine of coordination that no fighting force in the galaxy had encountered, and they had been placed inside the enemy's command structures decades before the war began. Alliance operations failed for reasons the Alliance could never determine. Fleets arrived where they were expected. Defenses opened. And the Jedi, who were the only people in the galaxy who might have recognized what was happening, were being hunted across a war zone as the criminals who had murdered a dozen worlds. The end of that war has a name, and it is not the name of a battle. It is Ossus. Ossus was one of the oldest places the Jedi had, thousands of years before any of this. It had been the intellectual center of the Order, the world where the great libraries were, and it had been devastated in an ancient catastrophe and slowly, over millennia, brought back. By this era, it was an academy again, and it was where a great many of the Order's people were, and it was where the project that bore its name had been coordinated from. The Sith went there to end the Jedi, and they very nearly did. The attack was designed around the one advantage 100 years of infiltration buys you, which is that some of the defenders are yours. When it began, there were Jedi on that world who had been serving in that order for their entire careers, and who were, and always had been, Krayts. They did not need to fight their way in. They were already inside, and they knew the layout, and they knew where the children were kept. What happened on Ossus was not a battle. Battles have two sides that are both trying. The Jedi were slaughtered. Masters who had led fleets in the Vong War were cut down in corridors. Students were killed in the places they had been told to shelter. The Order lost. In a matter of hours, the majority of everyone it had, and the survivors got out in small groups in whatever was still flying and scattered into a galaxy where they were already wanted for mass murder. One of the men who died there was called Cole Skywalker. He was the Grand Master, and he carried the bloodline that had ended the last Sith Empire, and, before that, had produced the one who built it. He fought at Ossus so that other people could get off the ground, and he was killed by Krayt's Sith while he was doing it. And it was a good death by any standard anyone applies to these things. His son was there and saw it. The boy's name was Cade Skywalker, and he was young, and he got away because his father spent his life buying him the minutes. Hold on to that name. He does not do anything for a long time after this. He does not become a hero. He does not train in secret. He does not swear an oath in the wreckage. He goes and does the opposite of all of it for years, in a way that is quite hard to watch. But he is the ending of this story, and he starts here, watching his father die on a world that was supposed to be the safest place the Jedi had. With Ossus, the war was effectively over. The Alliance had lost its shield and its legitimacy. Its capital fell. Its government dissolved into fragments and a fleet in exile. The Empire had won the greatest victory in its history and stood as the only power left in the galaxy. And the Sith had done almost all of the actual fighting. Roan Fel understood the position he was in. He was not stupid, and he had never trusted them. He had been watching this coming for a while, and he had made preparations. And when he moved to bring them under control before they could move on him, he was one step too slow and one step too late. Krayt took the throne. The mechanics of it are less interesting than the fact of it. There was an attempt to kill the Emperor, and it partly succeeded in that everyone believed it had. Roan Fel survived because someone else died in his place, and he escaped into hiding with a small circle of loyalists, and for years the galaxy believed him dead. His court, his fleet, his moffs, and his bureaucracy simply continued functioning, because a bureaucracy does not stop when the man at the top is replaced. It updates the name, and on the throne of the Empire, in the palace on the reconstructed capital world, there sat a figure in living armor. Stop here, because this is the moment the whole story has been walking toward, and it is easy to rush past it. He won, not almost, not for a while, not in one sector, not with a rebellion already forming in the Outer Rim on the day of his coronation. Darth Krayt held the galaxy. The Jedi Order was destroyed, and its survivors were scattered fugitives with a price on them. The Galactic Alliance had ceased to exist as a government. The legitimate Emperor was in hiding on a world nobody could find, commanding a remnant. There was no opposing power anywhere in known space. Every Sith you have ever heard of came up short of this. The ancient empires were broken by the Republic. The ones who came after burned themselves down. The most successful of all of them ruled for 2 decades before a farm boy and his father put him down a shaft. The Tusken boy from the sand held it all, and he was not finished. Because he did not want a galaxy he could tax, He wanted one he could fix, and he had a very specific idea of what fixing meant. He kept the empire. That is the first thing everyone notices, and it confuses people. He did not dissolve it, did not rename it, did not replace its structures with something Sith. He put himself on top of the machine that already existed and let it keep running. Because the machine worked. And he had never been sentimental about symbols. What he changed was the spine. The old orders had been served by dark side users who happened to work for a government. His government was the Order. Sith were placed at every level of it, not as advisors but as the actual authority, with the civilian and military structures reporting to them. The Moffs kept their titles and lost their independence. The military kept its ships and gained a Sith on the bridge of each of them. He put his own troops in the field, trained in his own methods, and he raised his hands to act with his voice wherever he could not go himself. And the galaxy under him was, by most measures that a statistician would use, stable. That is the deeply uncomfortable thing about this period. And any honest account has to say it. There was no civil war. Piracy declined. Trade moved. The great engines of galactic civilization turned over more or less as they had before. And on a great many worlds, the ordinary experience of life did not change very much, except that the tax was collected on time, and the local warlord who used to take a cut had disappeared. Krayt was not a chaotic ruler. He hated chaos more than he hated anything. He had spent his entire life watching disorder kill people who did not deserve it. And he was now in a position to remove disorder from the galaxy permanently, and he set about it with the same methodical competence he had shown as a general. The cost was simply that nothing was permitted to be outside him. Not dissent, obviously. But it went much further than dissent. Any independent center of power was a future fracture, and a future fracture was a future war. And he had done the arithmetic on what wars cost, and had decided that no amount of present suffering outweighed it. Local traditions that produced loyalties he did not control were ended. Institutions that had existed for millennia were absorbed or dissolved. Worlds that had a habit of governing themselves were given governors. And the Jedi were hunted with a thoroughness that went beyond anything the old Empire had managed, because the old Empire had been hunting a scattered remnant, and Krayt had a list. He also did something none of his predecessors had ever bothered with. He explained himself. He told the galaxy what he was doing and why. He did not pretend to be a republic. He did not claim emergency powers or promise a return to normalcy once the crisis passed. He said, in effect, that the crisis was permanent, that it was structural, that every free system the galaxy had built had collapsed and taken billions of people with it, and that he was not going to allow another one. He said that peace requires a hand, and that the hand has to be one hand, and that anyone who tells you otherwise is asking you to wait for the next collapse. And a great many people, across a great many worlds, agreed with him. That is what makes him the most frightening figure in this entire mythology. Not the armor, not the murders. It is that he sat on the throne of the galaxy and made an argument that a reasonable, exhausted, frightened person could accept. And the argument was supported by every fact of the previous century. He had one problem, and it had been with him since a shaping table 130 years earlier, and it was finally winning. The armor was eating him. By this point, it had been inside his body for longer than most species live. It had spread through the skeleton and locked around the organs, and there were sections of him that had no human tissue left in them at all. It had grown across his face until there was no face. only a shell, with something looking out of it. The living material required something from its host that a human being cannot indefinitely supply, and it had been drawing on him for well over a century. He was in constant pain. This is stated flatly in the accounts, and it is worth sitting with, because it changes the shape of everything he did in this period. Not discomfort, not the manageable background ache of an old injury. Continuous, structural agony. Every hour he was conscious, for decades, from a thing bonded to his nervous system that could not be anesthetized because it was part of the nervous system. He had also, by now, been fighting it for so long that he could not remember not fighting it. The dark side kept him upright. That is the only reason he was still functioning at all, and it is a bleak little joke that sits underneath his whole philosophy. He had built an ideology around control, and the only thing holding his body together was a continuous act of will that he could not ever stop performing. Not for a night, not for an hour. He wanted a cure, and he had the resources of a galaxy to look for one. Darth Maladi ran that search, and the search was as ugly as everything else she touched. There were laboratories, there were subjects. The number of beings taken apart in the attempt to work out how to get that armor off one man is not recorded anywhere and would not be believed if it were. Every technique in the medical literature, and several that had never been in it. Shapers, when any could be found, who still knew the old craft. Force techniques recovered from tombs by people who did not entirely understand them. None of it worked. The bonding had been done by artisans who were long dead and who had not been solving a problem anyone else had ever posed. And there was no method anywhere in the galaxy that could undo it, which left one possibility. And it came from a direction he despised. There is a very rare ability that shows up occasionally in Force sensitives, and it is not the kind of healing that speeds a wound or steadies a heart. It is the real thing. It reaches into a body and repairs what is wrong with it at a level that medicine cannot touch, and it is not a technique that can be learned by wanting it. Almost nobody has it. In a given generation, there may be one. In this generation, there was one, and he was the worst possible person. Cade Skywalker had spent the years since Ossus becoming everything his family had ever failed to be. He had not trained. He had not gathered survivors. He had gone as far in the other direction as a person can go. He was a pirate and a bounty hunter, running with a crew on a ship, taking contracts from whoever paid. And he was addicted to a spice that dulls the Force and had been for years, deliberately because the alternative was feeling it. He hated the Jedi, genuinely hated them, in a way that was not posturing. He had watched his father die for that order and had watched that order be exterminated because it had insisted on being decent in a galaxy that punished it, and he had concluded that all of it was a lie that got good people killed. He also had the healing ability, and he could not entirely stop using it. And every time he used it, the galaxy got a little bit closer to noticing him. Krayt found out about him. And what happened next is the most revealing thing this man ever did, because he did not send an assassin. Think about the position. Here is the last Skywalker, the son of the man who nearly stopped him, the bearer of a bloodline that had ended 2 Sith empires and had a documented tendency to appear at the exact moment a Dark Lord is about to complete something. Every rational calculation says, remove him. Instead, Darth Krayt decided he wanted the boy. He wanted the healing, of course. That was the practical part. But he wanted more than that. And the more is what makes this chapter of the story so strange and so revealing. He wanted an heir. He had built an entire order around the principle that no individual matters, that the Sith is one thing, and its members are parts of it, and that ambition is the disease that killed every Sith organization before his. And at the end of his life, with his body failing, he looked at a drug-addicted bounty hunter with the right surname, and he wanted to make him a son. He had him taken. And then he did something that is genuinely more disturbing than torture. He was kind to him. He offered him the truth as he understood it. He walked him through the argument. Here is what your order did. Here is what it cost. Here is a galaxy that has been destroyed 4 times by people who meant well. And here is a galaxy that has now been at peace for years under a single hand. He did not lie about any of it. He did not have to. He showed him the ledger and asked him to read it. And he offered him a place. Not servitude. The place beside him, and eventually the place after him. There is an account of this period in which Cade Skywalker, held in that palace, exposed continuously to that argument and to the physical presence of a man who had built the most stable galaxy in 4 generations, began to bend. He was not tortured into it. He was persuaded, partially, the way a person is persuaded. And the fact that he got out at all is closer to accident than heroism, but he got out. And the thing about that failure is that it left Darth Krayt exactly where he had been, except that now the whole galaxy could see it. The Dark Lord had reached for a cure and had come away with nothing, and his order had watched him do it. His people had begun to notice, not the ordinary Sith, the ones at the top, the ones who had been beside him for decades and who were closest to the thing that was going wrong with him, and who could see better than anyone else alive that the will at the center of their order was being spent on something other than the order. He had gone into stasis more often. He had spent longer in it. Decisions had been delayed. Campaigns had waited on a body that had to be suspended for months at a stretch. And underneath that, quieter and worse, the doctrine had started to bend around him. The rule of one says, there is one Sith, and its purpose is the Order. It does not say the Order exists to keep one man alive. But an enormous amount of what that Order had been doing for years was exactly that. Laboratories, subjects, expeditions, a hunt across the galaxy for a healer, all of it in service of prolonging the life of the individual who had written the philosophy that says the individual does not matter. Darth Wyerlock was the one who could see it most clearly, because he was the one whose whole function was the doctrine. He had been the voice. He had written most of what that order believed. And he looked at the founder and he made a judgment that, from inside his own philosophy, is very hard to argue with. Krayt had become an individual again. He had become a man with a personal desire, and that desire was consuming the Order, and the Order was supposed to outlive any man. The rule of one, applied honestly, required his removal. So Wyerlock killed him. It was not a duel, and there was no confrontation of equals. He waited until the body was at its weakest, in the chamber where it was maintained, and he struck with everything he had, and Darth Krayt, who had survived Order 66 and Kenobi and a Yuuzhan Vong shaping table and 150 years of a creature eating him from the inside, was killed by his own high priest in a quiet room with nobody watching. And then Wyerlock did the intelligent thing. He did not announce it. He hid the body, and he told the Order and the galaxy that the Dark Lord had withdrawn into deep meditation, into seclusion, into the kind of long communion with the dark side that a being of his stature occasionally requires. It was entirely plausible. Krayt had been disappearing into stasis for a century. Nobody was surprised, and Wyerlock ruled in his name, as regent, speaking with the Founder's voice exactly as he always had. And for a period of time, the galaxy was governed by a dead man's authority, exercised by his murderer. There is a case that this was the correct decision. Wyerlock was not seizing power for himself in the ordinary sense. He genuinely believed he was saving the Order from the man who had made it. He would have said, and did say, that he was the only one still following the rule of one. He was also wrong about one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered. He assumed that the body was dead. It was not. And the reason it was not is the single most horrifying detail in this entire story, because it had been sitting there in plain sight since the beginning. A von Duon crab is a living organism that has been bred over a span of time nobody can properly measure, to keep the thing inside it alive. That is its only function. It is not armor in the way plate is armor. It is a creature whose entire evolved purpose is the persistence of its host, and it does not have opinions about whether the host has stopped. For 150 years, it had been growing through him. It had taken the skeleton and wrapped the organs and threaded itself into the nervous system. And every year there had been a little more of it and a little less of him. When Wyerlock killed the man, he did not kill the other thing. And the other thing began, in its patient, mindless, biological way, to repair what was left. There is a second component to this, and the accounts do not agree on how much weight to give it, but it cannot be left out. Darth Krayt had spent a century as the most concentrated single will in the galaxy. He had spent decades in stasis with nothing to do but hold one idea in place. Whatever a Sith Lord's presence in the Force actually consists of, his was not a small thing, and it did not disperse. So, there was a will with nowhere to go, and there was a living organism whose sole function was to reconstruct a host, and they were in the same place. What came back was not resurrected in the way that word is usually meant. Nobody performed a ritual. There was no bargain, no phylactery, no ancient technique recovered from a tomb. He came back the way a wound closes, and the thing that closed it was not on anyone's side, and it was worse. That has to be stated plainly because it is the payoff of everything. The body that reassembled itself in that chamber was more the armor and less the man than the one Wyerlock had killed. The balance had shifted permanently and in the wrong direction. Whatever remained of Asharadhet, the desert, the father, the boy who would not remove his wrappings had been thinning for a century and a half. And this was the point at which it stopped being meaningfully present. He was stronger. He was faster. He was harder to hurt than he had been in decades. Because the thing that had been slowly killing him had finally been given a free hand. And what it produced was extremely efficient at staying alive. And he was no longer, in any sense, a person would recognize. A person. He walked back into his own court. There is no account of what Darth Wyerlock said, and it is almost better that way. Picture a Chagrian who has spent months carefully governing a galaxy in the name of a man he personally murdered, being informed that the man is in the corridor. Krayt killed him. Of course he killed him. But the manner of it is worth noting, because it tells you What had changed? There was no debate about doctrine, no examination of whether Wirelock had been correct, no acknowledgement that the argument had any merit at all. The founder of a philosophy built on the removal of individual ego executed his high priest for the crime of applying it, and did not appear to notice the contradiction. That is how you know the man was gone. The old Krayt would have seen it. The old Krayt built his entire order around the assumption that he himself would eventually need to be survivable. The thing that came out of that chamber simply removed an obstacle and moved on, and then it went to war on everything. The last phase of his reign is the shortest and by far the most destructive, and it happens because he had stopped calculating. Everything he had done for 150 years had been patient. A century of silence. A war started with a single lie. An alliance accepted and then broken at exactly the right moment. He had never once been in a hurry. Now he was in a hurry. And the galaxy paid for it. He escalated. Worlds that had been governed were now occupied. Populations that had been managed were now made examples of. The careful, unglamorous competence that had kept the galaxy quiet under him was replaced by force applied at maximum. And the whole logic of his rule inverted. He had taken the throne on the argument that a single hand prevents catastrophe. He now spent his final years producing catastrophes at a rate the old empire never approached. And in doing so, he did the one thing his entire strategy had been designed to prevent. He created an opposition. This is worth going slowly on, because it is the mechanism of his defeat, and it is entirely his own doing. For years, the galaxy's resistance to him had been useless, and it had been useless for the reason he had engineered. It was in pieces. There was Roan Fel, alive after all, with a loyalist remnant and a claim to a throne. There was what was left of the Galactic Alliance, a fleet without a government. There were the surviving Jedi, hiding in ones and twos on worlds where nobody looked. There were Mandalorians, and there were independent worlds, and there were criminals with grudges. Every one of those groups hated the others. The Fel loyalists and the Alliance remnant had spent a war killing each other. The Jedi were still blamed by most of the galaxy for a dozen dead worlds. There was no version of these people cooperating, and Krayt had spent his whole career ensuring there would not be. And then he became frightening enough that they did it anyway. It was not a grand alliance, and it was not built on trust. It was built on the recognition, arrived at separately by every party, that the thing on the throne was no longer running a government, and that there would shortly be nothing left to argue over. Imperial loyalists flew alongside Alliance ships. Jedi came out of hiding and stood next to people who had hunted them. Old enemies got into the same room and did not resolve anything, and went to war together anyway. He had spent a century and a half proving that a divided galaxy destroys itself, and at the very end, he united it, personally, by being the one thing everybody could agree on. The last battle was over the capital, and it went the way these things go, which is expensively. The details of the fleet action do not matter as much as what happened on the ground and then aboard the ship, because that is where it ended. Cade Skywalker came for him. He had spent the whole story running from this. He had spent years dulling himself with spice, specifically so that he would not have to be what he was. He had refused every version of this role that anyone offered him, including the one Krayt himself had offered, which had been by some distance the most tempting. And in the end, he did it anyway, and not out of destiny, and not because a prophecy required it. He did it because his father had died at Ossus, and because he had been in that palace and had seen what was on the throne, and because he was the one who was there. They fought, and it was not clean. And Cade Skywalker was not the better swordsman. But he understood something that no one else had worked out. And it was the same thing that had almost destroyed the Jedi, and had definitely destroyed Wyalok. You cannot kill this by killing the man. There has not been only a man in there for a very long time, so they did not stop at killing him. What was left was destroyed completely, and deliberately, by people who had learned exactly how much of a mistake it is to leave a body of his lying around and assume the matter is settled. Nothing was preserved. Nothing was studied. Nothing was placed somewhere secure to be examined later, which is the error every civilization in this galaxy has made at least once. They removed him from existence with a thoroughness that reads, in the accounts, as something close to panic. Darth Krayt was gone, and here is the ending, and it is not the one anybody wanted. His order survived him, not as a remnant, not as a handful of stragglers. The one Sith came out of the fall of their founder still functioning, still coordinated, still holding positions inside institutions across the galaxy that nobody had identified. And they went back into the dark and continued, because that is what he built them for. Every previous Sith order in 10,000 years died with its master. That was the flaw. That was the thing he identified from the doorway of a tomb on a red world. And it was the entire problem he set out to solve. And he solved it. He built a body that did not depend on its head, staffed by people who had been selected and trained and raised across 4 generations to believe that the individual is nothing and the order is everything. They believed it. They believed it more consistently than he did. In the end, Wyalok had believed it enough to murder him for violating it, and had been right, and the order carried on afterward exactly as designed. Darth Krayt got what he wanted. That is the terrible fact at the bottom of this. He wanted a thing that could not be killed by killing him. And he made one. And it worked. And the galaxy is still dealing with the consequences long after there is nothing left of him at all. So look at the whole shape of it now, from the beginning. A boy is born in a desert to a people who believe that a person is defined by what covers them. And he is wrapped, and he is taught that to be uncovered is to cease existing. He loses his father to a shot he never saw, and learns that strength does not protect you. He is taken into an order that trains him and never accepts him. And he keeps the wrappings on through all of it, because they are the last thing that is his. He fights a war and discovers that the principles he was taught are negotiable, and that everyone knew, and that nobody was going to say so out loud. He watches that order be erased in an hour by a plan it never detected, and finds that he was right about all of it, and that being right has cost him everything. He goes home and builds something, and an old man in the desert takes the covering off him and ends him by his own law. He wanders for decades with no name and no people, and then something from outside the galaxy catches him and opens him, and puts a living creature inside his body. And while they do it, he cannot feel them, because they are not there in the only sense that has ever mattered to him. And he escapes wearing a covering that can never be removed, made from the flesh of the one enemy the Force itself is blind to. And it grows into him for the rest of his life. He was made by other people's hands. Every single stage of it. The tribe wrapped him. The order shaped him. The war hardened him. Kenobi stripped him. The Shapers rebuilt him. He never once got to decide what he was. And so he spent the last century and a half of his existence doing to a galaxy exactly what had been done to him, taking things apart and putting them back together in a shape he had chosen, removing what was outside his control, making absolutely certain, on a scale of 100 million worlds, that nothing would ever again be able to reach in and change him without permission. He called himself after the thing that lives under the sand of his homeworld, the thing you hear before you see, the thing that is already underneath you by the time you understand what the sound was. He was not wrong about the galaxy. That is what makes him the most frightening figure in any of this. Every collapse he pointed at was real. Every institution he said would fail did fail, on schedule, exactly as he predicted. He was the best diagnostician the dark side ever produced. He simply could not tell the difference between saving something and owning it. And by the time anyone could have explained it to him, there was nobody left inside the armor to explain it to.